folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. So, Father's Day came and went, and my usual response to people whenever they ask me what I want for Father's Day is Amazon gift card. So, I got a good Amazon gift card, and I pretty much went straight home and cashed in on some new music. And so, beginning of this month and probably the middle of next month, I'll have a new couple of roundups for you, just stuff that's going to be in rotation for a little while. I enjoy doing these because it does give me a little bit of a chance to maybe critique albums that may not make it in the long run. But I also like doing it just as a document for what I've been listening to. And it's a spot, too, where most of the time, if you're a person who is interested in maybe newer music or just kind of an overview of what's going on, that's the venue. This is the venue for them, okay? So, but the thing about these, they got to go usually really, really quick. I do between like 4 to 6 albums. This is going to be a 6-album one this time around, so I won't be able to talk too much on each particular album, just to give you some impressions on them. All of these I've just been listening to this past week, so I don't have a whole lot of insight yet on them, but I have some impressions, and at the very least, if I get this first impression, I listen to it more, and I don't believe it anymore, I can come back and make another post and tell you that, well, what I thought before was malarkey, and this is what I really think. So we'll start off with Frank Zappa's You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore, Volume 2. Now, we just got through doing the posts on Volume 1. So I pretty much immediately got Volume 2 in rotation. Now, Volume 2, I can tell you, is significantly different than his approach to Volume 2, was significantly different than what he did with Volume 1. Volume 1, and this is my understanding how most of the series is a collection of various recordings from throughout his history with various bands, okay? This is a singular recording of one night with one band. And it's the 1974 recording of the group that was led by Napoleon Murphy Brock, had Ruth Underwood on mallets, had George Duke on keyboards, had Chester Thompson on drums, Tom Fowler, I believe, on bass. And this is the same group that did the Roxy and Elsewhere recording. So the question arises is, what does this album add to Frank Zappa's repertoire that wasn't already covered by the Roxy and Elsewhere album? And I'm going to have to go back and review Roxy and Elsewhere in light of the release of this album. You know, Roxy and Elsewhere was released in the 70s. This was released kind of more in retrospect. My first impression of it is that it's a very complete concert from beginning to end. Very little like sort of editing or changing the song's order. It feels like almost like a bootleg. But this is something I have to do a little more research on. But I will tell you that the recording is fantastic. The 74 band is one that I like, but was not my first introduction to the band. Many people cite this band as their favorite one. I don't think it's my favorite one, but I do think it's a band that set a new standard for Frank Zappa in his history. As far as, you know, a big bump in the quality of musicianship that happened there. So this is going to be one that's going to be in rotation for a while. I'm not going to really respond to it until I have a really good grasp on it, but that's going to be out there. So keep your eyes open for that one. Okay, thing number 2. This album by a band called Khruangbin. I believe that's how you say it. I have never actually said that out loud. They are an Austin-based trio that play kind of like super laid-back funk style music. They're very, very outstanding musicians, can really put things way, way deep in the pocket, have a really great groove, very distinctive feel to what they're doing. great morning after music. It's the album you put on when you're trying to clean up after an embarrassingly terrible party at your house. Nobody wants anything too loud, but everybody wants something they can just kind of sit back and enjoy. And that's what this album is, I think, is geared towards as far as functionality goes. The thing that I would draw as a kind of critique of the album is that it's very, very same. It's very consistent throughout, which is great. But, it's a hard, kind of difficult to tell one song from the next on first listens. It's mostly instrumental. There are some songs with some very laid back vocals on them. And it's an enjoyable listen. But we'll see how it fares in the long run. I am not super drawn to it over and over again. I'm more drawn to watching them play these songs live than I am the actual recording. The live videos of me watching them play were very, very intriguing. The studio recording feels a little sterile, but we'll see how it plays out. I'll continue listening to the Khruangbin album. Next up is the new album by the Raconteurs called Help Us Stranger. Now, the Raconteurs is an interesting group because it's a group made up of Jack White of the White Stripes and Brendan Benson. Now, here's the thing. I was a very, very big fan of Brendan Benson long before I was a fan of the White Stripes. I followed him from his very first album all the way up through when he kind of ended, I'd say ended his career, but he was very prolific for a long time, and my understanding was recently he got a family and kind of decided to come off the road a little bit and has been more on the production side of things. But this is the first thing I've seen from him at all come out in a few years. And of course, Jack White. Everybody kind of saw the Raconteurs as Jack White's other band, and I was sort of like, it's Brendan Benson's other band. I think that Jack White is a great songwriter. I think that Brendan Benson is a fantastic, amazing songwriter. I have a whole post about him back in the text days of the blog. He's one of my all-time favorite pop writers. But they write well together, but their styles don't always mesh. And so even though they write songs together, I always feel like I can tell, here's the Brendan Benson part, here's the Jack White part, here's the Brendan Benson part, here's the Jack White part. And I always kind of long on all their previous recordings and on this one to hear them fuse their two styles together. It still feels a little disparate, and this particular album has that same thing. The Raconteurs never unseated either Brendan Benson's solo work or Jack White's work with the White Stripes as being my favorite thing. I always found it interesting how they found ways to kind of go back and forth between the two styles. Even though they don't really mesh very well, they still tend to take interesting turns into each other's styles back and forth. And that kept the Raconteurs interesting for me in the past. And we'll see if that's the case with the new one. To tell you the truth, I'm not super excited about this album on my first listen. The production seems kind of odd. The drums seem very loud, which is weird for the White Stripes and for Brendan Benson. They're usually very good in the production department. Maybe it's just a little bit of a different approach that I have to get used to. Okay, the next one is this album by this band called Crumb, and the album's called Jinx. Jinx came up a lot of kind of excitement and buzz about Crumb's debut album. They've released a couple of EPs that people have been very excited about. They're kind of a 21st century psychedelic group. There's a connection in their sound, sort of like current psychedelic groups, kind of like Tame Impala, is the kind of the thing that sort of comes to mind to a degree. But they're not quite so obviously retro as Tame Impala is. Tame Impala was, in my opinion, in one of my posts previously, I said they're sort of like what they are to the 1970s psychedelia as M83 is to the 1980s. They kind of try to cop an idealized version of that style. Although Crumb sounds kind of vintage, I wouldn't say that they're really particularly retro. They do have a very nice kind of floating, non-Euclidean soft sound to their group, but it's still very unsettling. It's not just like easy listening. Things that kind of sets me off on it just a little bit is the vocal style that the lead singer uses. It's fine. She's got a very nice melodic approach, but it seems very kind of lazy. Almost like my first impression was kind of like the Drunk Cardigans. But as I've listened to it more, I've kind of let go of that comparison. But you can kind of see what I mean. But there's a loungy feeling to it, and her vocal style is very kind of slidey and relaxed, which is, I think, can be a distinctive characteristic rather than a criticism as I've become more used to the Crumb style. Okay, the next album I have is by a band called the Lost Crowns. Now, the Lost Crowns I discovered on one of my favorite progressive rock websites. They have progressive rock websites, and they have this section there where different editors make suggestions. And out of 5 editors, 3 editors made this album like their most, their favorite album of the year so far. So I kind of had to check that out. So I got the album, and I will tell you, it's fiendishly complicated, much more complicated than I expected. Progressive rock is supposed to be, complex and sometimes challenging, but this is really over the top, fiendishly complicated melodic components, lots of constant modulations that are unsettling, and kind of hard to zone in on. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just not going to be an album that's very accessible in the beginning. It's going to take a lot of listens to grab onto it, and I've got to find a hook for it. Anytime you're listening to an album that has the super complicated, I've got to find something to kind of grab onto so that I can focus in on that as other parts of the puzzle kind of come into place. So there's a very fun song actually that once I kind of heard what the song is about, kind of grabbed my attention. A song called Sound is Color, where he sort of tries to call BS on people who say they have, synesthesia and they see sound as color.
Some people say they can't see sound as color. I don't believe they can. They don't know their imagination ends, or maybe they just want to impress their friends. They make out they've got some special secret skill, but I don't believe them, and I never will. It's no use sitting on the fence tender, saying this does not make sense. Sound can't be purple, blue, or green. What's heard is different from what's seen.
And I think that's kind of a funny take, especially coming from a guy who's making such challenging music. It's pretty interesting. So that's what I'm going to have to listen to quite a bit to kind of decide how I feel about it. But this is, again, one that I would suggest checking out, especially if you like complex music. That venue, that website that I discovered the Lost Crowns on, they have a section there. It's the DPRP, and they have something for the weekend, a Dutch progressive rock page, and they have something for the weekend where they make suggestions. 2 years ago, I discovered this band Seabuckthorn. Seabuckthorn had an album that ended up being my album of the year before last, Turns, and they just recently released this new album, Crossing. Seabuckthorn is interesting because they're an ambient group, but I kind of call them ambient prog or progressive ambient music because it's not just airy nothingness in what they're doing, what the project does. It has a definite sense of building an environment to it that I think that sometimes is lost in other ambient music. It's not overly dark. It doesn't create interest by becoming very grating or whatever else. It kind of reminds me in some ways. This newest album kind of reminds me of back when I used to play the game Myst. That soundtrack. Now I think if you side by side that soundtrack with The Crossing, it won't sell. You won't see the similarities there. But that had a certain sense of mystery and of solitude to it, and I think that Seabuckthorn captures that as well. It's complicated. It's contemplative, and vaguely menacing, but also very satisfying. And Seabuckthorn had a previous album last year that came out that I enjoyed, but this one I think kind of captures something that I really loved about them in the first place. So I'll probably be listening to this one a lot. I've already kind of put it on spin more than once, and it really has captured my attention. So Seabuckthorn's Crossing. So that's all I've got for this one. I got through all 6 of those albums, and I will, in a couple more weeks, I'll have another overview once the rest of the music that I've ordered comes in. I've listened to it a little bit and get some ideas about it. In the meantime, I'll continue giving you guys the weekly album of the week, basically, for you to check out and explore on your own. All right? And until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.